When we ask why narcissistic behavior so often goes unnoticed, we must begin with an uncomfortable truth. What harms us most rarely looks harmful at first. In many cases, it arrives wearing a smile. Narcissistic women frequently possess a refined social charm, warmth, wit, emotional expressiveness that immediately lowers psychological defenses. This charm is not accidental. It functions as a mask, a persona carefully shaped to meet social expectations and disarm critical thinking. As if Carl Jung has observed, the persona is not the self. It is the face we present to the world. The danger begins when we mistake the mask for the soul. Society is conditioned to interpret charm as goodness and confidence as integrity. When a woman appears emotionally articulate, empathetic, or socially admired, we unconsciously assign her moral credibility. This creates a psychological blind spot, subtle manipulations. Emotional withholding, quiet dominance, moral superiority are reinterpreted as sensitivity or strength. Those harmed by her behavior often struggle to name what they are experiencing because the outer image contradicts the inner reality. The mind resists that contradiction, and so it rationalizes the harm away. What makes this pattern especially powerful is that charm recruits allies. Friends, colleagues, even therapists may defend her, not because they have examined her behavior, but because they have been emotionally impressed by her presentation. Meanwhile, the person on the receiving end of the manipulation begins to doubt their own perception. If she's so kind to everyone else, they think the problem must be me. This is how psychological damage becomes invisible, not through force, but through persuasion. Charm, in this sense, is not merely social skill. It becomes a form of camouflage. It allows narcissistic patterns to operate in plain sight while remaining socially protected. And unless we learn to separate appearance from impact, we will continue to excuse what quietly erodes us. The reflection to carry forward is simple but demanding. Stop asking how someone appears and start asking how they make others feel over time. Because truth reveals itself not in charm, but in consequence. Once charm has secured protection, the next pattern emerges almost instinctively: emotional victimhood. This is where narcissistic behavior becomes nearly untouchable. Any attempt at accountability is met not with reflection, but with collapse. Tears appear, voices shake, past traumas are summoned. The focus subtly but decisively shifts from what was done to what is being felt. In psychological terms, this is not vulnerability. It is defense disguised as suffering. From a Jungian perspective, this is a sophisticated maneuver of the psyche. As Carl Jung understood, the unconscious does not merely hide, it compensates. When the ego feels threatened, it produces symbols and emotions powerful enough to restore control. Emotional breakdown, in this context, becomes a symbol, a way to dominate the moral space without ever addressing the original issue. The moment sympathy enters the room, accountability quietly exits. What makes this pattern so effective is that modern culture treats emotional expression as proof of innocence. If someone is crying, we assume they are hurt. If they are hurt, they must not be the one causing harm. This logic feels compassionate, but it is psychologically naive. Pain and responsibility are not opposites. They often coexist, yet emotional victimhood collapses that complexity into a simple narrative. I am suffering, therefore I cannot be questioned. Those who confront such behavior often leave the interaction feeling confused or even guilty. They came seeking clarity, but instead they find themselves comforting the very person who caused the harm. Over time, This conditions them to stay silent. They learn that speaking up only results in emotional chaos, social backlash, or moral reversal. Silence becomes the path of least resistance. The deeper danger is internal. When this pattern repeats, individuals begin to distrust their own moral instincts. They suppress justified anger, reinterpret boundaries as cruelty, and mistake endurance for virtue. This is how psychological erosion occurs, not suddenly, but slowly, through repeated surrender of one's inner authority. The reflection to sit with is this: compassion without discernment becomes self-betrayal. If you want to break the cycle, you must learn to hold empathy and accountability at the same time, because true care does not erase truth, it demands it. If we look deeper beyond individual behavior, we encounter something far more powerful than personality, culture itself. Cultural double standards act as an invisible shield, quietly protecting certain behaviors while condemning the same traits in others. When narcissistic traits appear in men: control, emotional coldness, entitlement, they are quickly labeled as toxic or abusive. Yet, when these same traits appear in women, they are often reframed as strength, independence, or empowerment. This is not equality, it is psychological distortion. From a Jungian lens, society projects its unresolved contradictions onto individuals. As asterisk Carl Jung-inspired noted, what we fail to consciously integrate becomes projected outward. Modern culture carries a collective guilt around the historical suppression of women, and in attempting to correct that imbalance, it often swings to the opposite extreme. Harmful behavior is no longer examined on its own terms, but filtered through ideology. The result is moral confusion. Aggression expressed emotionally is still aggression. Control delivered through guilt is still control, but cultural narratives soften these realities. A narcissistic woman is described as setting boundaries, while those harmed by her are accused of being fragile, insecure, or unable to handle a strong personality. Language itself becomes a defense mechanism, shielding behavior from scrutiny. By renaming it, this double standard creates a dangerous imbalance. It teaches society to respond not to behavior but to identity. Accountability becomes selective. Psychological truth becomes negotiable. And those on the receiving end of manipulation are left without a socially acceptable language to describe their experience. When harm cannot be named, it cannot be addressed. What makes this especially corrosive is that it trains people to distrust their own perceptions. If culture tells you that what you are experiencing is not abuse but empowerment, you begin to question your sanity rather than the behavior in front of you. Over time, this erodes moral clarity. People stop asking, "Is this right?" and start asking, "Am I allowed to object?" This is how narcissism survives at scale, not just through individuals, but through systems that excuse, justify, and normalize it. And no system changes until people are willing to challenge the stories that protect it. The thought to carry forward is this: true empowerment does not require immunity from accountability. If a behavior cannot be questioned, it is not strength, it is power without conscience. As these patterns deepen, manipulation evolves into something far more subtle and far more difficult to confront: gaslighting disguised as emotional intelligence. Here, narcissism no longer appears loud or chaotic. It appears educated, reflective, even therapeutic. The individual speaks the language of self-awareness fluently, using words like triggers, boundaries, healing, and growth. On the surface, it sounds mature. In reality, this language becomes a tool to rewrite reality itself. From a psychological perspective, this is one of the most advanced defenses of the ego. As Carl Jung understood, knowledge of the psyche does not automatically lead to wisdom. In fact, when psychological insight is unintegrated, it can be used in the service of the shadow. Emotional intelligence, instead of illuminating truth, becomes a weapon to confuse it. The narcissistic individual does not deny events outright. She reframes them. She questions tone, intention, and memory until the other person begins to doubt their own experience. You're projecting. You're emotionally dysregulated. This is your unresolved trauma speaking. These statements sound clinical, even caring, but their effect is corrosive. The conversation shifts away from behavior and toward diagnosis. The one raising concerns is no longer a participant in dialogue, but a patient being analyzed. This creates a profound power imbalance. One person defines reality, the other defends their sanity. What makes this especially damaging is its plausibility. Outsiders often side with the person who sounds calm, articulate, and psychologically informed. The one who is confused or emotionally reactive appears unstable by comparison. Yet that emotional instability is often the result of prolonged gaslighting, not its cause. The narcissist appears centered because she controls the narrative. Over time, the victim internalizes this voice. They begin to self-monitor excessively, second-guess their perceptions, and suppress instincts that once protected them. The inner compass erodes. When language no longer reflects lived reality, the psyche fractures. This is the quietest form of domination. No shouting, no obvious cruelty, just a steady undermining of truth through polished words and plausible explanations. And unless one learns to distinguish insight from manipulation, intelligence from integrity, this pattern can persist indefinitely. The reflection to take with you is this: clarity is not found in who sounds most enlightened, but in whose version of reality consistently requires you to doubt yourself, because real understanding restores your mind. It does not erase it. At this stage, the pattern is no longer sustained only by the narcissistic individual. It is sustained by silence, particularly male silence. Many men who experience emotional manipulation or psychological abuse struggle not because they cannot see what is happening, but because they feel they are not permitted to name it. From an early age, men are conditioned to endure, to absorb, to remain composed. Pain is something to overcome prused. Pain is something to articulate publicly. When the harm is emotional rather than physical, that conditioning becomes a trap. In this context, speaking up feels like a violation of identity. To admit being manipulated by a woman feels, to many men, like an admission of weakness or failure. Shame enters quietly and does its work efficiently. The mind begins to minimize what is happening. It's not too bad. I should be able to handle this. Others have it worse. Silence becomes framed as strength, when in reality it is often fear wearing the mask of resilience. From a Jungian perspective, this silence is the repression of lived truth. As Carl Jung-inspired lived truth, as a pushed into the unconscious, does not disappear, it returns distorted. Unspoken experiences turn inward, manifesting as self-doubt, emotional numbness, anger, or depression. The narcissistic dynamic thrives in this environment because it requires no confrontation. The absence of resistance is mistaken for consent. Social reactions reinforce this silence. When men do speak about emotional harm, they are often met with disbelief, ridicule, or moral suspicion. Their pain is reframed as insecurity. Their boundaries are labeled control. This teaches a brutal lesson. Staying quiet is safer than telling the truth. And so the cycle continues, not because the behavior is invisible, but because acknowledging it carries a social cost. Over time, this erodes something essential. Men begin to distrust their emotional instincts. They detach from their inner experience to survive the relationship. To survive the relationship. What is lost is not just peace, but self-respect. A person who cannot name their own suffering becomes easier to control. The reflection to leave with is this: silence does not make you strong. It makes the pattern stronger. The moment you give language to your experience, you begin to reclaim authority over it, because truth spoken clearly is the first act of psychological freedom. The final pattern completes the circle, and it is perhaps the most discouraging one to face. Society does not punish the narcissist, it punishes the one who tells the truth. When someone finally speaks calmly and clearly about what they haven't experienced, the response is rarely curiosity. More often, it is suspicion. Motives are questioned. Character is attacked. The focus shifts away from the behavior being exposed and toward the credibility of the person exposing it. This is how power protects itself. From a psychological standpoint, this reaction is predictable. As Carl Jung understood, groups resist anything that threatens their shared illusions. A narcissistic individual who is socially admired, emotionally articulate, or culturally protected becomes part of a collective narrative. Exposing her behavior does not just challenge one person, it challenges the group's self-image. And when that happens, the group instinctively defends the illusion rather than confront the truth. The truth teller is then assigned a role. He becomes bitter, obsessed, unstable, or dangerous. His pain is reframed as resentment. His clarity is labeled fixation. This is not an accident. It is a psychological displacement. Rather than ask, is this behavior harmful? Society asks, why is he making us uncomfortable? The discomfort itself becomes the crime. What makes this pattern so effective is that it isolates the individual at the moment they most need support. Having already endured manipulation, doubt, and silence, they now face social rejection for speaking honestly. Many retreat, others learn the lesson and never speak again. This silence retroactively validates the narcissist's innocence and reinforces her power. The absence of opposition is mistaken for proof, but there is a deeper cost. When truth is punished consistently, people internalize the message that reality is negotiable and integrity is optional. Moral courage becomes rare. Psychological health declines, not because people cannot see what is wrong, but because acknowledging it feels too dangerous. Yet every meaningful shift begins this way. Truth has always been inconvenient before it was accepted. It has always cost something before it changed anything. The reflection to carry with you is this: if telling the truth makes you the villain, you are likely touching something real, and choosing to stand by that truth, despite the cost, is not weakness, but the highest form of inner authority.